Welcome to the Attorney Post, your source for inside baseball talk about the legal field with the top attorneys in the country. Here's your host, Justin West.
This is just a quick note to let you guys know there was unfortunately a piece of equipment that kept dinging during this conversation, and I tried to get some of it removed in post-production, but it was so difficult to get it out of there without garbling up our words. I opted to leave it in, so hopefully this isn't too frustrating for those of you that are listening, because I think that what Cliff had to share in this particular episode is definitely worth listening to. So if you can put up with it, because it's definitely worth your time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Attorney Post, where we are going to be discussing various facets of the law with attorneys that are at the top of their game. Today, I'm really excited to have Tulsa tax attorney Clifford Ribner with me. He runs a law firm that is eponymous. It bears his name, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of impossible tax problems and how to overcome those. But first, we are going to start with a word from one of our sponsors, as usual. We're going to jump over here. This is actually Clifford's website, first off. You can go to Ribner, ATTY, which is short for attorney.com, and you'll be able to pull up his site, which looks like this, and we'll come back here later probably and let you see it again. Obviously, there'll always be a link in the show notes below as well. Our first sponsor today is going to be Rocket SEO from hundreds of customers. Are you a business owner who knows that being on page one of Google is important, but you're afraid to work with an SEO company because you know that SEO is very expensive and sometimes very slow? Well, not anymore. Rocket SEO from hundreds of customers forces you to page one of Google safely and legally through the power of the news media. National media campaigns will rank instantly, boosting your website's ranking in Google in 48 hours or less sometimes, with a super simple system that leverages the power and authority of established media brands, your ABCs, NBCs, CBSs, and Fox News affiliates, amongst others, and it can launch you to page one in under a week. We do this by leveraging the power of those authorities, which oftentimes rank not just once or twice, but 2, 3, 4, even 5 times on the top of page one, and also lift you up. If you're interested about learning more, visit hundredsofcustomers.com/rocket. Again, that's hundredsofcustomers.com/rocket. All right, and now I am joined with Clifford. He goes by Cliff, so I'll be calling you Cliff for the rest of the show. How you doing today, Cliff?
I'm doing great.
Awesome.
How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Well, Clifford is a man who bills himself as a guy that solves impossible tax problems. You can actually read that on his website. And I found this blurb and I liked it so much, I'm gonna lead in with this. He says this on his site: IRS personnel do not resolve cases favorably for taxpayers to be nice, or even because it's reasonable for them to do so. They only do this when they're forced to, out of concern over the hazards of potential litigation against the taxpayer and his tax attorney. With a unique combination of specialized tax law and litigation training and experience, Clifford provides the highest possible hazard of litigation against the IRS for his clients. Clifford is a litigator and trained tax lawyer. He got his JD at NYU in 1977, and also 78. He was the Lasker Scholar, got his LLM. He's recognized as the nation's premier, it's recognized as the nation's premier training ground for tax attorneys. He also has a AB, magna cum laude in 73 from Cornell. He's a former professor of tax law at Tulsa University. He's got an AV rating with Martindale-Hubbell, and he's had a continuous AV rating since 1985. Over 42 years of experience in complex tax law and litigation, including multiple jury trials and appeals. And I thought this was really neat. He's only ever had 2 clients who were named targets of criminal investigation that were ever indicted. On average, I'm told it's around 85% of people that are named wind up getting indicted. He's only had 2 in his entire time. So, question 1, as we go into our discussion today, Clifford, what did I miss?
No, that's a very good summary. What it is anytime you're dealing with either the IRS or the Justice Department in the case of a criminal case, or some civil cases, all the criminal stuff is handled by both the IRS and the Justice Department. Anytime you're dealing with a government agency, you're dealing with bureaucrats. You have to understand the psychology of the bureaucrat. They're there not to do anybody any favors. They're not serving any real purpose other than their own and that of the bureaucracy. And they get promoted because they get scalps, and it's really that simple. It's horrible to point out, but that is a fact. The federal bureaucracies that are there are not there to do any good to American citizens at all. They literally prey on us. The IRS, in my view, is the only one that's actually constitutional, because they got the 16th Amendment that legitimizes the IRS, although it doesn't legitimize all of the powers that they exercise. Congress has given them extraordinary powers. The most draconian stuff that's available to them was literally, it's been in the code, the Internal Revenue Code, ever since it was first enacted in 1913. And the way they were able to bring it together so quickly after the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was passed was they literally Xeroxed the income tax laws of Bismarck's Germany, the people we had just been involved in, or we were about to be involved in World War I with at that time. Mm-hmm. And the worst stuff that's in there, the criminal statutes and the employer withholding stuff, it was in there from day one. And that was the first time that there were ever federal tax crimes. Even though the federal government had tax laws, that's how they got their money. It was primarily from whiskey tariffs, by the way, and whiskey taxes. But there had been taxes since the Republic started, but they weren't allowed to prosecute any crimes. If you didn't pay your taxes previously, there was no criminal enforcement until the federal income tax was passed. And that what and they have all these very, very tough crimes and the threshold for committing a tax crime, if you make any infraction in your compliance, is very low. It's essentially the same as simply making a mistake. The only difference is that your state of mind when you do it. The government has to prove that you were willful in your non-compliance. But think about it. There's a crime of tax evasion. Who doesn't want to evade taxes? I mean, but anyway, that stuff was all in there. It's the only statutes in the Internal Revenue Code that have never been changed. The rest of it's been changed millions of times. The code is vastly larger today than it was when it started. And I couldn't tell you how many amendments there have been, let alone the proposed amendments over the years. Anyway, the statutes involved with crimes and employer withholding are identical, almost word for word. They've made a few very, very minor changes in some of the criminal statutes. But other than that, it's exactly what was in there in 1913. And what's really amazing to most people, all the employer withholding stuff, which is how they get all the money. They force your employer to treat you effectively as if you're a recalcitrant judgment debtor who's refusing to pay a judgment, and the employer is garnishing a portion of your salary before you even get it. That's what the employer withholding statutes are. They were in there from day one, and they never had the nerve to enforce them until World War II. Isn't that amazing? It was in there for 30 years, and they never did it. People didn't even know they were in there. And the reason for that was they didn't think the American public would tolerate it until the patriotism level had reached the pitch that it reached during World War II. That was the first time they were willing to do that. Anyway, I don't know how we got on that subject.
Oh, it's a little bit of background in law, and some of this is stuff that I'm at least somewhat familiar with. I know that you've. We'll talk about your book later, because you were talking about how you have a mind for history. I actually have a bachelor's degree in history as well. I find it fascinating that nowadays we accept a tax rate that's incredibly high, and I think we do accept it kind of in the name of patriotism. But I wonder if our founding fathers aren't rolling in their graves because they fought a war over a 3% sales tax, whereas nowadays we regularly accept anywhere from 10 to 30%, depending upon bracket, etc. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, if you think it's high now, what if it was a 97% rate, which is what it was during the Eisenhower administration? Kennedy cut taxes. And he thought it was a big tax cut. He cut it down. The highest rate after Kennedy's tax cut was 70%, to give you some idea how high they were. Eisenhower was a Republican, and during his presidency, it was 97%, as it was the highest rate. And you got there you know, at what would be several $100,000 in today's money. So you could, now there were all sorts of ways around it. And
yeah,
so
I've been told that was the base rate, but there were lots of deductions or credits or ways to get it
well,
down.
you had to do stuff to get those.
Yeah, you had to know the law.
Yeah, well, and you had to make certain investments. It was possible to get it. You could use real estate. There were a variety of ways, but you had to invest in particular stuff to get the deductions. Anyway, yes, the rates are, there's no question the founders would be shocked. They would not only rolling in their graves, they'd be like pinwheels. As a matter of fact, the way they wrote the Constitution, they knew what an income tax was. The Louis XIV had imposed a 10% income tax in France. The British didn't have one. They had no income tax. The first time the British had an income tax was during the Napoleonic Wars.
Sir.
I can't talk to you now. My receptionist was. Anyway,
That's all right. I can pause or edit those out if needed.
During the Napoleonic Wars, they imposed an income tax for the first time in Britain. And the only reason for that was they were terrified that the French were going to get across the English Channel. And they were very worried about it. That was and they got rid of the income tax as soon as they could. But there was no income tax when our founders fought the British. There were a bunch of other taxes, but they recognized that the income tax was particularly pernicious because it gives the government in order to enforce it, the government has to get involved in looking into all your affairs.
Yeah.
If you get audited, they ask you for everything. They can look at your bank accounts. It's really horrible. They did not want that. And what's shocking to me today, looking back on it, is the American public went along with it. It's really shocking. And the government has been, the higher the taxes, the more broke they get. It's pretty much what's been going on. They fought. World War I was the first war with an income tax, and throughout the 19th century, before there was a Fed or income taxes, the government did just fine. In effect, they had to pass the income tax when they passed prohibition, because they were making all their money off of the whiskey tax. So the two of them were intertwined in that sense. But it's really, for people that are subjected to the audits, it's really a nightmare. And it can be really, even if you've done absolutely nothing wrong, it's just a nasty experience. And there are certain types of audits they force people into, which they claim they're doing for educational purposes, that are really bad. And I've had clients that have had to do that. The income, but as I said, of all, if you have to deal with any federal agency about anything, it's a nightmare. The difference between the IRS and the rest of them, at least the IRS is constitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits things like the SEC. They just went ahead and did it, and the Supreme Court rubber stamped it. But there's nothing in the Constitution that permits it. And at the same time that they were trying to get prohibition passed, which simply outlawed sales of alcohol, they just went ahead and created the FDA, which completely regulates all food and drug or medical devices. They just went ahead and did it. So how is it that alcohol uniquely required a constitutional amendment, but having the government in charge of all food and drugs and everything like that didn't, they could just go ahead and do that. But you can search in vain in the Constitution for any place where it empowers them to do that. But as I said, at least the IRS was, they have to be able to collect the taxes that they authorized under the 16th Amendment.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I like what I'm doing, and I'll never retire. Every time I'm representing a client, for them, it's a life and death situation, even though they haven't done anything wrong. they are. It's like dealing with a bizarro world when you're dealing with them. It's what, if you've ever read any stories by Franz Kafka,
Mm-hmm.
he was ridiculing bureaucracies.
Yeah.
And that's he knew them inside and out. And he viewed his stuff as being comedy, by the way. But there's nothing funny about it. You really are turned into a cockroach like Gregor Samsa every time.
Yeah. It's absurdist comedy, not classical comedy, which would end on a happy note. Because it seems to end on a very unhappy note. I can say, our listeners, I've never shared this before. I think the scariest thing I ever got in the mail was a letter from the IRS that said I owed them like $60,000, plus another $15,000 in accrued penalties, and it was all because I simply, while filing my own taxes years ago, I filed or miswrote how certain deductions came out, and it really was just a clerical error, but I spent $10,000 extra in 2 years of my time just getting that stupid thing cleared up. And when we finally got it cleared up, it turned out that I actually had overpaid and they actually owed me an extra $2,000. But because of all the penalties and everything else, they decided they were still going to keep the $2,000 that they owed me. So I was out that, plus I was out the cost of hiring the attorney and the time I spent and everything else. It's just, it's an utter nightmare. So I think that you and I might be very kindred spirits. As some of our listeners may know, I'm rather libertarian at heart. I lean probably conservative, but I'm quite libertarian in general, and I've never been a big fan of the IRS. And so, talking with somebody who regularly sticks it to the man, as they say, is definitely it's a worthwhile thing to do.
That's what I do. I represent real human beings against the greatest evil of our time. And it's really a blight on the country. This is a country that's supposed to be a country of free citizens, and we are forced into answering to these government bureaucracies. And whenever you have to do that, you don't feel like a very free citizen.
Oh, absolutely not.
And you're not. It happens that most of the agencies only deal with people in specific situations, so that not everybody encounters them. The IRS used to audit many more people than they do. They now audit fewer than 1% of all tax returns. So the odds of being one of the poor people who actually have to deal with an audit is very low. But when you are, you've lived through that.
Yeah.
And the other agencies are just as bad. And they have the same. The difference is they don't have any constitutional justification forever. So you're basically dealing with a lawless agency. The people in it are serving their own interests. They're all, they are all politicians, even though they haven't run for office, because they're there because they like exercising power over their fellow citizens, and that's what a politician is. And those agencies are filled with, and some of them are, nice people. They're not all monsters, but on the whole, they tend to be very left wing. They all belong to unions. The IRS union is extremely left wing. It's even more left wing than the other federal employee unions, which are pretty left wing. Of course, FDR believed that it was absolutely forbidden for any federal employees to ever be in any union. And you can't get more left wing than FDR, but he's no way. You can find the quote if you just Google or do a web search for FDR and federal or public employee unions, and you'll see a very interesting quote. And he was right. These unions they have a stranglehold on government and on government's finances, and they really are nothing but lobbying agencies. The first thing I do in an audit is I ask the agent, "Who's your shop steward?" And that always gets their attention.
So There's that famous quote about the two things in life that are inevitable, death and taxes. Is there any way around taxes? Can we abolish the IRS? Will that require another amendment, I trust?
It will require a constitutional amendment since we've got one now.
And power never lets go of power, so the odds of it happening are slim
Well,
to none.
if the people of the country decided that it's completely appalling and they decide the government should be a fraction of its present size, that would be one of the first things they should do. I mean, the government had income before the income tax, and there was a taxing agency. I don't remember the name of it.
It was mostly tariffs, right?
Yeah, tariffs. Tariffs and duties. There was an excise tax on liquor and on a bunch of other things, but they weren't prohibitions; they were taxes, and the government was allowed to do that. What it is, the Constitution distinguishes between direct and indirect taxes, and some of the justices on the Supreme Court wanted to pretend that the income tax might pass muster without a constitutional amendment, so that there was actually some dispute among members of the legal profession of what was required to permit an income tax. And in fact, we had an income tax during the Civil War, but they got rid of it as soon as they paid off the debt from the Civil War. And its constitutionality was not tested during the.
I was going to say that would have been unconstitutional, I would imagine.
Well, I think so, but it wasn't tested, and it was a far cry from what we have now. It was two rates. 5% was the first rate, and you didn't get there until you were what would be middle class. And then the top rate was 10%. And you had to be making the equivalent of several $1 million in today's income to get to that. So it wasn't like it hit a lot of people. The government still made most of its money, even during the Civil War, not from the income tax. They just felt that they needed that in addition. The Civil War, of course, was devastating to the economy.
Well,
so
yeah.
It affected all taxes, and there were all sorts of additional monies that ended up getting spent. Bankrolling the creation of railroads, for example, and they were critical for military purposes. When you think about it, prior to the railroad, the only method of transportation was a horse and a buggy.
Yep.
So, how many cannons can you put on a wagon? And that was the technological limitations of what you could transport for military purposes. So the railroad it's impossible to fully comprehend how revolutionary that was, the creation of the railroad. Of course, the government couldn't wait to get involved with it. The very first federal agency that was involved in regulating a business, because they don't regulate it, they take it over. They don't own it, but they are put themselves in a position where they have the power to dictate control over what the business does. That's what they do in these agencies. They dictate the terms of contracts that they engage in, and the statutes that were used. It was in 1887, I believe, that the Interstate Commerce Commission was created. Now, it happens that what these agencies always do is they have the effect. I know this sounds crazy, but they have the effect of benefiting the then incumbent businesses, because and in fact, the railroad magnates at that time wanted it. They had seen what happened with these agencies, because these were common in Europe. Europe had the kind of laws where they create these agencies. Mm-hmm. And it was exactly the sort of thing the founders revolted against. They didn't want anything like that, but because they're inherently corrupt. What happens is the people that run the incumbent business get in bed with the bureaucrats, and typically they're much richer than the bureaucrats or the politicians. So they're in a position to control the politicians, who can then tell the regulators what to do. So there's this incestuous relationship between the regulators and the business that's regulated, and they create barriers to entry into the business. So they it makes it possible for them to form an oligopoly or even a monopoly. In the case of the phone company became the phone company because federal regulation shoved it down our throats. They made them a monopoly. And that's the only way monopolies or oligopolies can last for any amount of time, when they have the government basically creating them as one. And that's what really happens with all these agencies. It puts politicians and bureaucrats in control of the business and in control, in cahoots, basically, with the people that are controlling the incumbent businesses as of that time. Makes it difficult for new businesses to try to compete against them.
Yep.
Because they're competing not just with the businesses, but with the bureaucrats. And it costs them more. There are compliance costs. They've got to fund lawyers and lobbyists. It's completely corrupt, and it does nothing of value to the public. What really and they always create these things by promising we're going to lower. They always do it by saying, "Oh, they're charging too much. We're going to create this agency that's going to make sure that everybody gets better prices and a better product." And exactly the opposite results. The prices have to go up because the businesses have to fund the compliance costs with the agency. Now, the IRS is unique in that there is no business there. You wouldn't be buying what they're selling.
I don't want it.
But they're set up the same way. The different agencies are set up differently in terms of the extent to which they answer directly to the president. They're all theoretically part of the executive department, but in most cases, the IRS it's been kept more. They haven't been answering directly to politicians at any point. Now, what's happened is, under certain administrations, they were in sync with the administration, like in the Obama administration. This was very unusual. The the Internal Revenue Commissioner, went to talk with people. He didn't always talk to Obama, but he talked to underlings in the White House. He went up there hundreds of times. That never happened before. Mm-hmm. And you had situations where, the notorious actions of Lois Lerner, where she was using political criteria to invalidate or prolong the tax exemption procedures involving conservative organizations getting a tax exemption, and basically weaponizing the IRS. Mm-hmm. Now, she was hired precisely to do what she did. She was not a tax lawyer. Typically, people that are in the high positions in the IRS are usually people that have been tax lawyers previously. And she was very high up in the exempt organizations group. She wasn't a tax lawyer. Her previous experience had been at the Federal Election Commission. She was specifically hired. She was known to be extremely radical and a radical leftist and very hostile to conservative groups. And that's why she was put in there. Nobody had to give her any orders to do anything. But the IRS has typically, most presidents have not gotten involved telling them things. Nixon got in trouble because he had the fantasy of having some of his political entities or enemies audited, but he never actually did it. It was just something he talked about on a tape. And it's a very strange situation where you have these agencies that have no constitutional authority, really, that answer to no one other than the people that run them, who are completely unelected bureaucrats.
And they have the power of the gun.
Yes, they do. They literally, the IRS has less power than some of the others. The other agencies, like the Labor Department, they're in a position where they want to be able to dictate all of the terms of employment contracts. and even who is an employee and who isn't. The IRS gets involved in that as well because of the employee withholding stuff. It's tougher to be an employee, or it's easier for the agency to force someone into employment status under labor policies than under the IRS ones. By the way, that's one of the types of fights that I get involved in, where the IRS alleges that the IRS wants to claim that everybody who does anything for anybody else is an employee, because then they get to stick the person who's paying them with withholding obligations. So they don't believe in independent contractors. But during the Jimmy Carter administration, the Congress passed an uncodified law to stop them from doing that, believe it or not. And it's in the Revenue Act of 1977. Anyway, their criteria for determining who's an employee and who's an independent contractor. And right now, under the Biden administration, they're trying to change the law so that nobody can be an independent contractor at all. They literally are altering the nature of contractual relations in a business setting completely. They are presuming to do that. Congress just passed, and now it hasn't made it through the Senate yet. Right. But it's very radical legislation. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and I happen to believe it's completely unconstitutional. Congress does not have the power to dictate the terms of interhuman relationships. And that's what they're doing. But the labor, essentially, when you see all these executives, like in Georgia with the Coca-Cola and the airline, now again. You have to remember that none of those executives have freedom of speech, because they all answer to multiple federal agencies. And if any of those agencies tell them, we want you to do X, you have to salute and do X. Because as it is right now in the federal, every time you violate any regulation, and there are hundreds of thousands of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. These are all they're called regulations because none of them were passed pursuant to the procedures that are dictated under Article 1 of the Constitution. None of them. So that they can't claim that they're laws, but you try telling someone the difference between a law and a regulation if they're sitting in jail or they just got stuck with a big fine. And all of those regulations, not one of Congress passed a thing called the Administrative Procedure Act, which is essentially their fig leaf to try to pretend that these things have a constitutional legitimacy. But anyway, anytime you violate any of those, you're committing a felony. And nobody knows what's in there. I don't even know anyone who's capable of reading hundreds of thousands of pages of regulation just to find out. So we're now in a situation where if the government wants to go after any executive, he probably has committed multiple technical crimes just going about his business. It's impossible not to, or at least getting close to the border. And the Justice Department has often been extremely aggressive in pushing the envelope. In fact, the bureaucrats in the Justice Department are rewarded when they push the envelope. This happened with Arthur Andersen, where they got they literally put the world's largest public accounting firm out of business with a multitude of indictments, all of which were ultimately thrown out in the greatest Pyrrhic victory of all time in the Supreme Court, which ruled that they couldn't read the statutes that way. But Arthur Andersen was already dead at that time. But this is the kind of thing and the federal prosecutors in the Justice Department who were involved in those prosecutions, you'd think they would get their knuckles rapped, right? Mm-hmm. Well, remember, this is the world of Franz Kafka. They got promoted. And in fact, the ones that did the most violence to justice by using falsified evidence, they really got promoted. Some of them had to attend a little ethics class but they, I mean, it was literally not even a slap on the wrist. And if they weren't promoted within the agency, some of them had to leave the agency for a decent interval, and they went in as partners in white shoe firms and made millions of dollars before coming back to the agency. The entire team of lawyers that Mueller hired to go after President Trump, that's who they were. They were the lawyers who you can actually read about this. Sidney Powell wrote a book about it called License to Lie.
License to Lie. I'm familiar with the book.
Well, that's who those people are. And that's who you're dealing with in the Justice Department. Now, not everybody in the Justice Department is that aggressive in pursuing their careers, but the ones who really want to are really, some of them are just lifers. They're happy to go there and just get their pension eventually. Most of the people in the local office in this city are like that. They're not interested. They think they're doing justice, and I think they try to within the parameters of their bureaucracy. But particularly when you have to deal with the people in offices like in Washington or New York, those are very career-minded people. The youngest ones are people who went into the Justice Department. They want to be able to move in as a partner in a white shoe firm as soon as they can. Say 5 years instead of waiting 10. And the way to do that is to get some scalps, or try pushing a statute beyond its rational reading. And that's exactly what they do. One of the things that I do when I represent people who are targets of the criminal people is to essentially have there's two bureaucracies involved in those cases. There's the IRS and the Federal Department of Justice. And one of the things that I do is use the insanity of the two bureaucracies against each other, to try to, because basically anyone who's a named target, they already have enough evidence to convict you before you become a named target. That's the threshold. That's why 85% of them do get indicted.
So you kind of make a feedback loop between the two agencies and force them to use their regulations and statutes against each other, or?
Well, that's one of it's basically recognizing the dynamics that are involved and the internal rules and seeing what I can do to throw sand in the gears.
So how do you make someone, quote, the highest possible hazard of litigation? Or how do you provide that highest possible hazard? What hazards are there that you can wield against such bureaucracies?
I've taken them to court and I've beaten them. I won a fairly well. It's among tax lawyers. It's known. It was a case back in the 1980s involving a franchisee who sold his franchise back to the franchisor, and the IRS had a way of taxing the franchisee in those cases that they had been forcing on people for years. And what it was is when you sell it back, it was typically when the franchisee sells it back, sometimes he doesn't get all the money up front because he's going to get paid for how he's improved that particular franchise. So it's some performance element involved. So he might get an installment sale. Well, the IRS position before the case that I won was he couldn't use installment sale treatment, which meant that if the nominal price, say, was $1 million, he had to include the full $1 million in his income in year one when he sold it, even if it wasn't going to get paid for another 10 years. And the IRS position was he couldn't get a capital gain. It had to all be ordinary income. And at the time the case was litigated, the highest marginal rate for ordinary income was 70%, as compared to 20% for capital gains. So it was big. So you really got hosed if you sold the franchise back to the franchisor. The IRS position had been, well, when you sell it back to the franchisor, the statute that permits the capital gain requires what's called a sale or exchange. And their position was, well, if you're just selling it back to the franchisor, there's no sale or exchange because it just disappears. It's an extinction of the franchise.
Yeah.
Anyway, I beat them in that case, and they had to change their whole treatment. They had been bullying people in that position for decades. Anyone who ever sold their franchise, and of course there are some businesses that are heavily franchised, and lots of times when people retire, that's they don't necessarily. Some of the franchise agreements don't even permit them to sell it to a third party. They have to sell it back, or the franchisor has to be involved, and it makes sense. The franchisor would want to know who their franchisee is. Anyway, it became a trap for people who didn't know about that. Anyway, I won that case, and the IRS knows about it. It involved anyway. So it involved both installment sales and as a result of my case, the IRS did what they acquiesce. Sometimes when they lose a case, they file what's called a non-acquiescence, which means they're going to keep trying to stick people with the bad result. I'm not kidding. This is something. Anyway, they acquiesced in that rule. They were, and they didn't appeal it. But anyway, I've had other cases. Most of the cases that I've had against the IRS are, they're settled so that there's no judgment, no actual written opinion by a judge. That one, it was a formal tax court opinion. See, I wouldn't even take a case like that to the tax court now.
Yeah.
The tax court has become a hostile environment for taxpayers, in my opinion. What it is when you do tax litigation, you can pick the court you go to, which is unlike most litigation. You can decide to go to tax court, or if the client is able to pay first, you can pay and then sue for a refund. You can go to federal district court or the court of claims, or you can go to the federal district court in your own district, or you can go to the one in Washington D.C. So you could decide which one of those courts is going to be the best place for you. So it's an unusual type of litigation. There's lots of unique aspects to it, but when the IRS is dealing with me, they know they're dealing with someone who is both a real litigator and a real tax lawyer. I've done jury trials also. There is no jury in a tax court case, but there is in federal district court.
So are you on a hit list somewhere?
No, they're very nice to me on the whole. Or I have never had there have been a few cases where I've had to file a complaint about the revenue agent. Some of them are dishonest. I have triggered as a result of my actions. I've triggered criminal investigations of several of them on occasion. It usually benefits my client enormously. It's amazing.
Oh.
It's amazing how a revenue agent who's been really bad in the audit gets real soft after the criminal. The only reason I even knew about the criminal, like when you're under a criminal investigation by the IRS, they don't announce it. The only way you find out is if you get interviewed, or if someone gets interviewed in connection with it.
Otherwise, they kind of keep it hushed up.
That's how I knew about those. But some of them are really now some of the dishonesty. This is how pernicious it is. The way the IRS is set up. Anytime you're dealing with someone, you're not really dealing with that person at all. That person is a sock puppet for someone much higher up the food chain who is telling them what to do. It's called a stovepipe management structure. And this was created during the Obama administration. They made it much more top-centered during the Obama administration than it had ever been before. And there are certain types of agents. You have to know who you're dealing with anytime you're dealing with these people. There are regulations that the agents are subject to, and you can force them to comply with those. It's called the Internal Revenue Manual.
I'm sure
And
that's a light read.
it's, if you really have terrible insomnia, that's the place to go.
So let's take this in a more practical aspect for at least a couple of minutes here. What can the average person do? We have a lot of business owners who listen to this podcast. We have attorneys that don't specialize in tax law that listen to this podcast. What can the average person do to minimize their risk with the IRS and being audited, et cetera?
Well,
If there is anything.
they're first of all, they should never talk to them. They should never try to do it themselves. And they need to hire someone who knows what he's doing. In an audit situation, you can't, it depends on the situation. Sometimes it's okay to use the accountant who did the return, but the IRS has tried to create a situation in which they've been trying to turn professionals against their own clients, and this is something they've been trying to do for many, many years. They've been trying to they've created a regulation. They call it Circular 230. It doesn't even have a regulatory name, but what they're trying to do is impose duties on CPAs and on lawyers who represent clients, where they want to turn the CPA into a rat on his client. And CPAs do not have a privilege of there's no CPA client privilege,
right,
of communications the way there is with lawyers. And they've tried to force CPAs into a situation where they almost have to rat on their client. If there's anything questionable on a return, it's dangerous to use a CPA, and it's insane for the client to do it himself. I'm sure everyone is familiar with what happened to Martha Stewart. She tried to handle her. It wasn't the IRS, but the same law applies. Anytime anyone talks to anyone who's employed by the federal government, if you make any false statement, and you may not even know it's false when you make it. If you make any false statement, you can have just become a criminal. So that I consider the hazard of talking to the IRS an unacceptable business risk. It doesn't matter how pure you are. It's simply an unacceptable risk for any businessman to talk to them. I would never. And the problem is, it sounds like when you communicate with them, it sounds like they're talking English, but it's not. It's a different language. It uses the same vocabulary, but the words have different meanings, and it's very easy to inadvertently lie, or at least within their context. And as soon as you've completed any conversation with any federal employee, and that can be the janitor, I'm not exaggerating, any person who works for the federal government, as soon as you've completed your conversation, they then make a memo of that conversation, which you don't see. Now, I can get those for my clients, and when it's necessary, I do a Freedom of Information Act request and do get those. But this is a situation that is so dangerous, where you can have someone who's completely innocent, who literally puts themselves in jail, and just by trying to be a good citizen. No good deed goes unpunished when you're dealing with the federal government.
Wasn't that even what sort of, and you mentioned Sidney Powell earlier, so I'll just ask, I know she represented General Flynn, and in a sense, isn't that what they got him on, was an inadvertent statement that was technically untruthful, but based upon what he thought they already knew, and that was a off-the-record discussion?
In his case, it wasn't even untruthful.
Yeah.
It was a complete railroad. And everything about that interview that they did was completely illegal. But of course, it ruined his life. That now he was in a position where he was going to be talking to people in the federal government every day, no matter what.
Right.
What he was that he was being preyed upon by this other agency because they were instructed to do that. They can. It's just like in the Soviet Union. Beria told Stalin, "Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime." And I am not exaggerating. It is simply an unacceptable business risk for citizens to speak to the government. Anytime I have a client who who is approached to speak to them, I immediately intervene. I've had to argue in front of federal judges on a number of occasions, and I don't let my clients speak to them. Some of the agents are very sweet about how they ask for it, but it's just too dangerous, and
Yeah.
it's not worth. Also, it's just not worth the aggravation. Even if, and the problem is you can inadvertently say something that puts you in jail or
Yeah.
puts you at risk of that. The actual number of people that they prosecute for that is tiny, but they pick and choose who they want to go after. It's really despicable. It is most federal prosecutions are done selectively, and when they're honest, they'll tell you that. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division is up front that all of their prosecutions are selective. They could literally indict half the country right now if they really. I'm not kidding. If they really wanted to, and of course that would make collecting taxes a little difficult.
Yeah.
But the way the tax crimes are drafted, um, practically anything can be. If you file your return at 1 nanosecond after midnight, and you have hatred in your heart for the IRS and the idea of paying your taxes, and you knew that it was due 1 nanosecond before midnight, arguably you've completed the crime of failure to file the return. And filing it later doesn't undo it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that proves that you knew you should have done it in the first place. So that's like a confession that you committed the crime. This is how crazy it is. But that's why it's just a huge mistake for people to try to handle these things themselves. And the IRS, under different presidents, they are more or less insistent on people being interviewed. Under the Obama administration, there were significant changes that I had not ever seen before, and I've been doing this since 1979. In terms of the insistence of the demand to talk to clients.
Yeah.
Certainly, anyone who hasn't filed returns or has anything at all, questionable on their return. If they had any idea how crazy it was to talk to them, they wouldn't even think about it. It's mostly, and they rely on the fact that people don't know. They literally don't know what they're getting into, and everybody assumes, well, these are just nice government employees. How bad could it be? It can be really, really bad.
So I'd like to officially go on the record and state that I have no hatred of the IRS at all. In fact, I love them and I think they're doing a great job. Please don't audit me. Gosh, you are the type of guy, Clifford, that I could sit down for like another 3 or 4 hours and probably keep talking. And I'm probably going to try and have you back on, in fact, because I love this discussion. I love this concept. I think it's a very important thing for especially people in the business owning world out there to know, etc. But I don't want to take up all of your time. I know you've got other people you got to see as well. So I'm going to probably use this as an excuse to shift our conversation one more time and do a little bit more talking about you and what it is that you actually do for your clients, because of course I do want to focus on that as well. But I think we've already demonstrated to everybody listening that Mr. Ribner here knows what he's talking about. He is vastly recommended. In fact, you had something else on your website. I might pull it up and read it in a minute. Basically, you said, please feel free to ask any judge or any lawyer that you may know or trust if he or she would feel comfortable in referring you to me. Referrals are how most of my clients come to me. So I think that you seem to have one of those reputations that just precedes you, and I'm sure it's based entirely upon all of the success that you've had for your clients. So let me ask you kind of a contradictory question here. Have you ever failed? Which is to say, can you tell our listeners a time that maybe you thought something was going to go one way and it didn't, or some sort of a moment that would be in some ways considered failing, but that you learned a lesson from and overcame. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you don't win them all.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have, cases that you just can't win. I had a case back in the 80s that I lost in tax court. It involved a tax exemption case. I was picking up the case after one of my partners had handled the work in which the record was created for that particular taxpayer. It's called it's a published opinion. It's called Church by Mail. Anyway, they lost I was unable to rescue them. So they lost their tax exemption during the audit, and the record was such that you don't get to have a new trial. It's just a matter of if you can spin the facts and the law to convince them otherwise. And the stuff in the record just blew the tax court judge away, and he didn't have a lot of patience for that particular church.
Huh.
But anyway, that was a disappointment.
Yeah.
I thought that it was a kind of case where if I had handled the audit, I think I could have gotten them out of that. It wouldn't have had to go to court.
Gotcha.
Now the lawyer who handled it was a very good lawyer, but he didn't really know the IRS. He had his own opinions about certain things, and he wasn't a tax lawyer.
Yeah.
And it's a typical thing that happens when tax litigation is its own beast. There's nothing else quite like it. If you can do tax litigation as I do, you can do any litigation, because the complexity of the tax law is way beyond. It's at least equal to the most complicated areas of any other law, but it's got its own special quirks, not just the agencies that you're dealing with, but just the whole way the thing operates, and the opportunity. The law itself is so complex that if I can get a case early enough in the stages of it, I can almost always make sure it comes out with a happy ending. It's when I have to get it after the damage has been done that that's when it creates problems. I just won a case about a week ago. It's not a court case. It was before the Oklahoma Tax Commission, where another firm it was a complete disaster when the client came to me. She owns a little restaurant, and this restaurant, in a good year, in the best year, this restaurant had gross receipts of $500,000, and this other firm that pretends to be tax lawyers and advertises heavily, I won't say their name, but anyway, they pretend to be tax lawyers. They had handled the audit, and they agreed to a deficiency of supposedly according to them and the OTC, she underpaid her sales tax by $600,000 over about a 3-year period, in a restaurant that in a good year only made $500,000, grossed 500. Anyway, they had basically destroyed that case, and there was no access to court under Oklahoma tax laws are very, very tough. The Oklahoma Tax Commission has powers that the IRS can only dream of. I'm not exaggerating. I actually consider the Oklahoma tax procedures unconstitutional. And I have another case in court that I may be arguing that. It depends on what the client chooses to do. But anyway, they had actually conceded that. They had failed to file what's called a protest after the audit. And when you don't file the protest on time, you're really out of luck under those statutes. It gets written in concrete real fast. Anyway, the Oklahoma, I ended up arguing it in front of the actual Oklahoma tax commissioners. There's 3 of them, and they were there, and they had never seen anything like this, and they set it aside. They've now given this client new life, and
it was happily ever after.
Well, we fixed it. She's going to end up getting a refund of $163,000. She was in this little restaurant. She was having to pay $6,000 a month. And that's an example of what if an incompetent firm gets involved in these things, they can really mess it up, and they did. A lot of my clients are come to me from some of these other operations that they're not. How they call themselves tax lawyers is beyond me, but that was a great victory for her. And I mean, there's not going to be a reported case or anything. No one will know about it unless, I mean, she'll tell her friends. But.
Right. Well, gosh, that's fascinating. I could ask a dozen questions with that. I would love to at some point dig into state taxation versus federal taxation. I'm assuming if people have an issue with the federal, with the IRS, you can work with people from almost any state. Would that be the case?
Yes.
But if it's unique to state tax, then that's going to be usually an attorney that's licensed in that particular state.
Well, actually, I happen to be licensed in New York also, but I have been involved in tax controversies in multiple states: Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, California. It depends on the state whether they permit an out-of-state lawyer to do it.
Gotcha.
Some states do. New York does not. They will if you. I mean, I'm a member of the bar there, so I can do it in New York. But if say, if someone was not a member of the bar and they started representing someone in front of the New York tax administrators, they'd accuse them of practicing law without a license and file a bar complaint with whatever state they're in. And some states, most of the states, it's surprising, most of the states are quite lenient about that. And I always, before I do it, I always ask, obviously, because you have to, the client has to do a power of attorney. And anyway, I have yet to have a state turn me down. And most states' tax laws, you can get, I have access to them.
Well, that's good to know. So anybody watching this, whether or not you're in Oklahoma, you can definitely go visit CNRIBNER. That's C Ribner, ATTY.com. Again, you can see it up here. We'll have the link in the show notes. But that is Cliff's website right there. That's C as in Cliff and Ribner as in Ribner, and then ATTY as in attorney.com. Well, here in a minute, I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions, and then we'll be wrapping this up. One of the questions I'll be asking you is the famous magic wand. If you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about the tax law that affects you or your clients, what that would be. And then I also do want to talk to you about that book that you wrote. So we're going to get to that here in just a minute. But first, I do want to read from our second sponsor. And as usual, our second sponsor is InjuryAttorneyLeads.com. If you're a personal injury attorney, you know that you regularly can spend a lot of money advertising, but most methods yield lackluster results. Oftentimes, you'll pay between $100 and $500 per lead and still wind up getting leads that are not qualified. If you ever even get a hold of them at all, often you can burn through 5 or 10 just to get one serious prospective client on the phone. The solution is InjuryAttorneyLeads.com. InjuryAttorneyLeads.com has people reaching out to them all across the country, and once those people fill out a form, which is where most lead companies start, or stop, InjuryAttorneyLeads.com is just getting started. They then reach out to every person who fills out that form on the phone and re-verifies their information before live transferring them qualified calls directly to your law firm. These are the only people who've been in an accident who want to talk to a lawyer about their case. You can be sure that these potential clients will meet your criteria for a qualified lead, and close rates average 60%. Set up a time to talk with a client generation specialist by visiting InjuryAttorneyLeads.com and scheduling a time to talk. Again, that's InjuryAttorneyLeads.com. Come back over here now, Cliff, to your website. So just to kind of round us out, this has been a great conversation. And again, I have a hard stop in about 20 minutes because I've got another podcast right after this. I'm going to have to be recording. So unfortunately, we're going to have to make a hard stop in the near future. But I definitely want to make time to talk to you about your book. So let me ask you that fun question. This is a question somebody else was asking me to start asking of clients, and I think it is kind of fun when you're dealing with law. So Cliff, if you could wave a magic wand and change something about the law, something that affects you or your clients on a regular basis, what would you change?
Well, I would repeal every single enabling all of the laws that enable the existence of every single one of the federal administrative agencies other than the IRS, and I would repeal the 16th Amendment. None of these things were in the original Constitution,
Yeah.
and none of them serve the people of the country at all. They serve the interests of politicians, and they advance corruption, and they facilitate the government spending money on things it shouldn't be spending money on, and they're really just of no value at all. Every single one of them, and that's what my book is actually about.
Well, let me ask you a side question, then we'll talk about that book. If you were to wave that magic wand and all of those organizations were gone, 16th Amendment was repealed, what would you do? Would your business be done, or would you find other ways to go after the government? I'm sure there's always overreach.
Well, I'd just be a litigator, and there would be tax litigation of some kind. I mean, there's always controversies involved, but I mean, I wouldn't limit it to tax litigation. The entire legal profession would be transformed. There would be no justification for these huge law firms. The reason they're so big is because they all have people that spend most of their time on compliance work. Reading regulations and dealing with these different agencies.
I had a friend. Go ahead.
I mean, basically, businesses can't do anything without consulting with their big law firm that has people who are experts in every single area of administrative law, and every little decision has to pass through all of those people, and it loads up the expense of doing business, creates no value whatsoever, other than for the lawyers and the bureaucrats that are involved.
Yeah.
This country has way too many lawyers, and it's not healthy. The other change I would make is there were changes made to the tort law during the 20th century in which liability was imposed in ways it had never been imposed before. It's called strict liability. Basically, under the law, someone was only liable if they had done something wrong, if they were at least negligent. Well, that went out the window during the 20th century, and the law professors who promoted this were absolutely upfront about it. They viewed this as a way of socializing risk. These were socialists, and they saw the use of the courts as a way to socialize risk. And what it does is it makes it dangerous for anybody to produce any product, because they can be liable even if it's misused by the purchaser, or not even by the purchaser, by someone who you don't even know. Yeah. So they become liable for that. These are risks that the victims could insure themselves against, of course. And the more you impose liability like that, the greater the difficulty of complying with it, because you may not even be negligent, and you can be stuck with huge liabilities that are essentially unlimited. That's one change. Another change that was made was the idea of a class action. Now, under the common law, if you were injured, but the injury was so trivial that you wouldn't go to court, you didn't have a case. And that's part of the law. One of the elements of a tort. A tort is a civil wrong, to those who don't know. Most people do. And I didn't know that before I went to law school. But it's from the French word wrong. Anyway, the law of torts, if you weren't at least negligent, originally you had to be intentional. You had to do something like trespass on somebody's property, or assault them, or defraud them. But it got to the point, or libel them, or slander them. But in the 20th century, they extended liability to people that were not even negligent, just so they could compensate victims. It was really so they could compensate lawyers, but because the lawyers push for this. But what a class and damage is one of the elements you have to make a tort complete. If you don't have enough damage, you don't have a tort. Well, what class actions did was they made it possible to have a bunch of people who had injuries, each of which was trivial, say worth 2 cents. And by having a class, you could then go after whoever had done this. That's really what class actions are all about. To make it and the only one who benefits from them is the
attorney. Yeah.
It literally is a cancer on our society, having these class actions. They are of no value. They literally are just nothing but cash cows for lawyers. I have friends who do that stuff, and they joke about the fact that they have no clients. I'm telling you a trade secret in disclosing this. But anyway, I would end all of the changes to the law in the 20th century having to do with class actions and the expansion of liability for tort law beyond a minimum threshold of negligence on the part of the defendant.
Gotcha.
Those would be the biggest change, other than getting rid of all those administrative. I mean, all these changes were done in the 20th century, and none of them serve the people at all. They serve the legal profession. When I was in law school, which was not that long ago, I mean, I'm not that old, but in the 1970s, to give you some idea how this has all blown up since then. Today, the largest law firms, many of them are 1,500 lawyers who don't even know each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I went to law school, I was a law clerk at Milbank Tweed, which is an old white shoe firm on Wall Street, and it was one of the biggest firms on Wall Street at that time. It had 170 lawyers. That wouldn't even be that would
tiny
be
today.
Yeah. And the biggest firm on Wall Street back then was Sherman and Sterling. They had 200. Which there are individual offices of Sherman and Sterling now that
are bigger than that.
Yeah, and I'm sure Milbank, I'm sure, is well over 1,000 lawyers. And what it is the growth. These administrative agencies began to proliferate after 1906, particularly, and they just keep growing. The more they're around, the more they grow. They're created ostensibly to solve a particular problem. They never solve that problem, and they sit around and they create new law, which they call regulations. They just create new things for them to do, and they constantly expand their jurisdiction, and none of it is of any value to American citizens. Oh yeah, that's my book.
For those of you not paying attention or just now tuning in, I asked Cliff the famous question if he had a magic wand, but Cliff actually took the magic wand and traded it in for a genie lamp and just made his 3 wishes, changing the law. Well, we're going to have to get going here in a minute, but I want to talk to you about this book. So this is Freedom's Last Stand, a common sense guide to understanding the tyranny of collectivist ideology. And this sounds like a much more interesting read than the tax code that we've been talking about. Tell us about this book. What encouraged you to write it? What is it about? What are people going to find in it? How was it written? How long is it? Looks like it's pretty new. Paperback at least came out in 16.
It's only been in paperback. It came out in 16. My publisher has done nothing to promote it, and which is unfortunate because it's really a terrific book. It's a history book. I majored in history at Cornell. Primarily the history of it's called early modern European history. Mm-hmm. Primarily English and French and American history. And this book is a history of the American Constitution and also a history of Britain and France, as well as America, basically from the 13th century on. America obviously wasn't there in the 13th century, but the Constitution has its roots in English, both English and French history of the 13th century. There's actually a chapter about French history primarily focused on Louis XIV. When people read the book, they're surprised to learn that Louis XIV is a very important figure in American history, even though you wouldn't think that. And that's what the book, as I said, it's a history book. It combines my interest in law and history. It's a history of the Constitution, really, the Constitution and its predecessors and what has happened with it since it was enacted in America. So it's not a comprehensive history of the United States, but you can't understand American history without understanding French and English history of the same time frame. And I compare the French Revolution to the American Revolution. In fact, there's a whole chapter 6, on the two types of revolution. You're now showing the table of contents. The book is very structured. Each chapter deals with the subject, but they are connected with each other in a very organized manner. And the book culminates in a chapter that describes how any single branch of government, including either just the president acting alone or either house of Congress, actually has the ability at any time to repeal all of these federal administrative agencies and fire everyone who works for them, other than the IRS. They can't do that to the IRS. And I actually have a chapter in which I've come up with a way for any one of them to do that. And it can be done at any time. The Constitution is not there is nothing in the Constitution that says how it's supposed to be enforced. And the fact is, the Constitution can be enforced by anyone. It's not limited to the courts. We're not dependent on the courts doing the right thing. If the president and the Congress get together and essentially collude, like if they're in the same party and they decide they want an outcome that's not permitted in the Constitution, they can do it, but it's not constitutional, and it doesn't become constitutional just because they did it. One of the favorite words in Washington is invoking what's called precedent. Like, well, this got done before, so that justifies it because the precedent makes it legal. Well, the Constitution actually has an entire article on how it's allowed to be changed. It's Article 5. And there's nothing in there about precedents. It doesn't say, well, if you violate this thing, then it becomes okay, which obviously would be ridiculous.
I punched you yesterday, so I can punch you today. There's precedent.
That's exactly what the logic is. But you'll hear politicians in Washington say, well, there's this precedent that lets us do this.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's nonsense that would make the Constitution a self-defeating document, because in effect, the benefits of violating it are their own reward. The violation becomes the justification for the violation. And in fact, the Constitution also has very specific language that says it's the supreme law of the land. Well, if you have to obey any law, you have to obey the supreme
law.
And it was not written. It was written by people who, most of them were lawyers, but it wasn't supposed to be only understandable by lawyers, and there wasn't supposed to be some priesthood of lawyers who got to, utter blessings and magically turn things that are unconstitutional into being constitutional. The courts are not given any specific power to do that. The courts cannot legitimize something that's unconstitutional, and neither can all three federal branches combining together do that. So the fact that something is a violation of the Constitution never goes away until it's gotten away with. And some people have talked about the need for a constitutional convention. Well, that's not going to get anywhere. If the Constitution is being violated now, how is writing new laws going to change that? All you have to do is invoke what's already there. Now, it's going to take a political leader to do that, and I was disappointed that President Trump didn't read my book, so he would have known how to do it. And he would have wanted to, I believe, if he read the book. Certainly the bureaucracy was not his friend.
Yeah.
And but he was unique among American presidents. He's the first American politician who was a very explicitly anti-American president. He's opposed to anti-Americanism.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, because the heart and soul of Marxism has always been anti-Americanism. The two, they don't just go hand in hand. It is the fuel that has motivated Marxism ever since the time of Karl Marx. He was an enemy of the United States during his lifetime. And just like all Marxists that have followed him, the one thing he could point to criticize America about was the racism involved in African slavery at that time. Now, of course, that hasn't existed since 1865, but you will hear today identical criticisms of America by people who act as if there was no Civil War.
Yeah.
Still have slavery today, supposedly. There's no distinction. It's nuts. But you will hear, and this is why it's like a broken record. They sound just like Karl Marx. When you hear them talking about nonsense like white supremacy, and that America is this racist country where black people are turned into slaves. Well, under Marxism, everybody is a slave. So it was always a ridiculous accusation.
Equality through mass slavery.
Well, it's putting the government in charge of everything. And I mean everything. It eliminates by design, it eliminates the entire private market in which people buy and sell things based on what they want to do. And in fact, the one freedom that is preserved in the original text of the Constitution, not just in the Bill of Rights, but in the Constitution itself, is the freedom of contract, because they recognize that the difference between a free man what they were doing in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution was reinstituting the rights of free Englishmen that had been won in a series of revolutions in England. Americans aren't taught this today, but there were two very big revolutions in the 17th century that the founders of America very self-consciously saw themselves as the successors to. They were trying to take the freedoms won in those revolutions, one of which lasted, 40 years or 20 years. I'm sorry. It's called the English Civil War, but it was a revolution. They chopped off the king's head. It was serious business, and there was no king in there. They didn't let the new king, his son, get on the throne, Charles II, until he agreed to a number of concessions that his father had refused to do. This stuff is this is in my book. It's stuff that Americans are not taught now, but you have to understand the Constitution in that context. They were preserving the freedoms of free Englishmen that had already been established and then taking them one step further, which is what they did in the Constitution. But the fundamental freedom that was always the distinction between a free man and a serf was the freedom of contract. And all of these federal agencies, their entire purpose, not just a bug, but a feature, is to interfere with the freedom of contract of free people. That's what they do. They dictate the terms of contracts. They even tell you who you can contract with. They dictate every step of every manufacturing device. It's the creation of everything that is produced. Literally, they dictate what has to go on in the factory, and it's shocking to anyone who understands the original Constitution.
Well, I just actually grabbed a copy, I guess, a free preview of your book. I'm probably actually going to buy a copy as well. And I'm definitely going to include in the show notes a link to this book, because I do think it sounds like it's a very important book, a very important historical basis. It'll keep you guys busy. It's 400 pages. I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to download the Kindle version or if I want to buy the full version. There is something about having the physical book in your hand that is very, very nice. But gosh, this has been one heck of a conversation. I hate to end it here, but I'm going to have to end it because I have to get ready for another interview here in a few minutes. But I just want to say, first off, Clifford, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me and my audience today. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm going to have you back on if you're willing, because I've really enjoyed.
I'd be delighted.
Awesome. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot already, and I feel like if we were to dig into just one or two of these topics, I feel like you could probably keep us busy for a couple of hours at least. I mean, if you can write 400 pages on this minimum, you probably got a little bit more in there you could drop on us. So, just as a shout out one more time, your law firm it bears your name. People obviously in Oklahoma, but also out throughout the United States can look you up. Clifford N. Ribner. That's cribneratty.com. cribneratty.com. You can go on there.
C.N. Ribner.
Oh, you're right. I am so sorry. What is the end? Is that Nathan, Nathaniel, Nicholas?
It's my middle name, Neil.
Neil.
The easiest way to find it, if you forget, is if you just do a web search for tax lawyer Tulsa, it'll pop right up.
All right. This is a man who knows his SEO as well. Good stuff. Well, Clifford, I like to always give you the last word. So do you have any parting words of wisdom for the listeners we have today?
Just don't do it yourself.
I think that's very sound advice that I've personally lived out, and will probably not hopefully make that mistake ever again. All right, you guys. Well, this is Justin West. I've been talking with Clifford Ribner of the Oklahoma practice. Just Google him, Oklahoma tax attorney. You're going to find him in lots of different places. He's got a great book on Amazon. The link for that book is down in the description down below as well. I'm going to go ahead and grab a copy of this. I can't figure out if it's going to be the Kindle version. Something about the paper again. I don't actually like reading on a Kindle. I've got one, and I always prefer the physical book. So I'm probably going to buy the physical book and have it delivered. But you've been listening to The Attorney Post. You can visit us online at theattorneypost.com. We'll have links to all of Clifford's stuff down below as well. We will be back with more interviews with more attorneys in the near future. But until next time, thank you guys very much for taking the time to listen to us today. Thank you again, Clifford, for being with us. And we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.